This is Yair Davidiy speaking from the land of Israel. Today we are about to discuss what happened to the Israelites after they were exiled, or at least concerning a portion of the Israelites after they were exiled. Israelites, I mean the lost 10 tribes. We had 12 tribes of Israel that were together in the land of Israel. First they were in one kingdom under the king Saul. After that David, Solomon. In the time of the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, the northern tribes, 10 of the tribes separated. They set up their own kingdom in the north. Under Yair ben Nabat from the tribe of Ephraim, they established their own kingdom. After more than a century, this kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, taken into exile, and they lost consciousness of their ancestry. This did not happen overnight. It went through a process of being taken into exile, resettled in another area, assimilating themselves into the framework of the Assyrian Empire, serving in various capacities, and eventually rebelling against the Assyrians and federating the other peoples and migrating with them. So we know something about what happened to a portion of them in this period, and that is what we are about to discuss. And this is also hinted at in the Bible and confirmed by archaeological findings and Assyrian inscriptions and the like, and other sources. And we're just going to go through it very quickly, give an overall view, because in other works and in other talks we have gone into it in more detail. So Micah, the chapter 5, actually describes this. It gives a comprehensive summary of what happened. In principle, all the prophets prophesied concerning the future, especially what will happen in the end times. Prophecy is mainly concerned for the end times. Well, the sages said that prophecies that were written down are concerned with what happens in the end times, but often they describe events that took place in their own time or shortly after their own time. So we may say that this is an example of prototypical prophecy, especially prophets who came after Moses. The prophets who came after Moses. Moses was in a different category. Moses spoke to God panim, face to face, and he had a direct understanding. The other prophets were different. They understood things by way of similes and metaphors. They were more limited, one could say, in their revelation, in their degree of revelation. And a prophet would intuit, he would understand what was going to happen shortly after his time. Sometimes within his time, sometimes 100 or so years afterwards. He would have a feeling of what would happen, and he would be right. It would be prophesied what would happen in that time, but he would change it somewhat, and he'd also use this picture that he had a grip on, one could say, because it was close to him, because what happens in the future, in the near future, is a direct outgrowth of what is happening in the present. So he'd have more of a grip on what was happening then, and from then he would extrapolate through divine inspiration into the distant future, so that these prophecies or these descriptions of what was happening or about to happen are reliable or are useful for us to understand what happened then, and they're also intended for us to somehow or another understand what will happen in the end times. So this is what happened. This is the case of the book of Micah, chapter 5, and he describes what happened when the Israelites were exiled, and they associated themselves with the Scythians, became associated with the Scythians, and overthrew the Assyrian Empire. How we understand it from the Bible, from other sources, from archaeological findings and so on, is that the Israelites were taken into exile into certain specific areas. We can trace many of these areas. We can find records of Israelites from Samaria, from the 10 tribes, serving in the Assyrian armies, and on occasion sometimes reaching high rank or having important tasks to fulfill in these areas, being governors, being high up in the Assyrian hierarchy, also just simply serving as farmers, as servants, some cases as slaves and stone quarries. We have all different things happen to different sections of the Israelite exiles. So a portion of them became quite powerful. They were independent to some degree, or had autonomy. The Assyrians were under the attack from their enemies, and the internal power of the Israelites grew. Whereas at the same time, a portion of them rebelled against Assyria. And they became independent of Assyria, whereas others were attached as federated forces, auxiliary forces to the Assyrian Empire. And due to a combination of circumstances, they managed at one stage, to take over the Assyrian Empire. At this same time, the kingdom of Judah, which had been subservient to Assyria, it also had enjoyed a degree of autonomy, but it had been subservient to Assyria. As a new king called Josiah, the son of Ammon, and of the kingdom of Judah became independent. He too more or less asserted his independence from Assyria by turning back to the worship of the God of Israel, since the Assyrians more or less insisted that their vassal kingdoms worship the gods of Assyria. So Josiah rebelled against them, threw down the statues in the places of worship of the pagans, and asserted his independence. And he made contact with the Scythians, who at the same time were establishing their control over Assyria and taking off the Assyrian yoke. Other Israelites at the same time had joined with the enemies of Assyria, such as the Medes and the Babylonians, and these other Israelites were in turn part of the Cimmerian forces. The Cimmerians and the Scythians were virtually one and the same people, federated groups of similar culture, and they are known in the Bible as Gomer. They are represented in the book of Hosea under the name of Gomer, showing that the Israelites had conjoined themselves with other peoples and were part of them to some degree. So this group of peoples was known as Gomer in the generic sense. A portion of the Gomer were the Scythians. So some of the Cimmerians were in effect attacking Assyria, whereas others under the name of Scythians were defending Assyria. Eventually, those Scythians who were defending Assyria changed sides, joined with the Medes and the Babylonians, and together with the Medes they attacked the city of Nineveh and other Assyrian cities and destroyed them. And indications are that the Scythians played a major role in these military actions. The book of Micah in its own way describes this. Together with other sources, we have the following picture, as it says in the book of Micah, chapter 5, "And this man shall be the priest when the Assyrians shall come into our land, and he, that is the Assyrian, shall tread in our palaces." And archaeological findings do show how the Assyrians tread in the palaces of the Samaria, of the Israelites, and destroyed them. "Then shall we rise against him, against Assyria, 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. And they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod, and the entrances thereof. And the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, as a Jew from the Lord. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles, in the midst of many peoples, as a lion among the flocks of sheep." So, as we said, the main point of these verses may be applicable in the end times, events that will happen in the end times, but nevertheless they also describe what happened shortly after the Israelites were exiled, and this is the way of prophecy as we have described it. So too, after the book of Micah, we have the book of Nahum. Nahum in the Bible. Nahum was also one of the minor prophets. As we said, the minor prophets are called minor prophets because they had short books. Their books were not as long as the major prophets. They were not like the major prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. They are major prophets because they have long books. The minor prophets have short books, and they're all put together or written up often in one roll of parchment. And they were known as the 12 minor prophets. And Nahum was one of them, as Micah was one of them. The book of Nahum comes in its reading after the book of Micah. And the book of Nahum describes the destruction of Nineveh and of Assyria and of related events. It's a short book, and that is what is mainly concerned with the destruction of Nineveh and other Assyrian places. And as we said, the Assyrians had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. They had exiled the 10 tribes. In their places of exile, the Israelites became attached to the Cimmerians and Scythians and identified with them. Then they rebelled against Assyria. Meanwhile, the Medes and the Babylonians waged war against her. The Assyrians at first were allied with the Assyrians. For a time they took over the Syrian Empire. Then they lost control, and after that they joined forces with the Medes, and began to attack Assyria, and played a major role in destroying the Assyrian cities. We have a passage in the book of Nahum chapter 2 verse 3, as it says in for instance, the King James book, the King James Bible. It says, Nahum 2:3 says, "For the Lord hath turned away the excellency of Jacob, as the excellency of Israel. For the emptiers have emptied them out, and married their vine branches." The point is, however, that in Hebrew this verse may actually be rendered differently. It may be translated directly from the Hebrew as saying this: "The Lord has returned the pride of Jacob, as the pride of Israel, and also the pride of Israel, of the 10 tribes. Because in that time, both Judah and the 10 tribes had rebelled against Assyria. For they who have emptied them out are being emptied out by them. And they will destroy their vines. They will destroy the vineyards and the centers of civilization of Assyria." That is how Nahum 2:3 may be understood. And this also fits in with our scenario concerning Micah, speaking about the 10 tribes of Israel. We will run through again Micah 5, a portion of it, just to emphasize how Micah is describing these events. He says, verse 5, he says, Micah 5:1, "Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days." David, the house of David, came from Bethlehem. Apparently they came from Bethlehem, which was a small township in the region of Ephrathah in Judah. And it was a small area, it was insignificant, and people were surprised that such an outstanding personality such as David should emerge from such a place. And he goes on, "Therefore shall give them up until the time when she is in labour shall have given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel." That is, the 10 tribes shall return and be reunited with the rest of Israel. "And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth." Now he's speaking about the end times, when the Messiah, son of David, shall come and shall restore the Israelites to their former possessions and to their former greatness, and his name shall be great until the ends of the earth, and eventually they shall establish their rulership over most peoples of the earth. And as well as having application for the end times, it also has applications for the time of the Syrian downfall. It also says in verse 5, "And he shall be their peace when the Assyrian comes into our land." The Assyrian comes into our land and treads in our palaces. Then we will raise up against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men. They shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword. At the beginning, the Scythians were allies. The Israelites with the Scythians were allies of Assyria. Well, they became that way. And afterwards, they took control of it. And then they were betrayed by Assyria or demoted by Assyria from that position. So they joined the enemies of Assyria and destroyed Assyria. Then, as it says, "They shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod at its entrances." Nimrod is another name for Assyria. "And he shall deliver us from the Assyrians, when he comes into the land and treads within our border. Then the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which delay not for a man, nor wait for the children of men. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations, in the midst of many peoples, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among the flocks of sheep, which when it goes through treads down and tears in pieces. There's none to deliver." Verse 9, "And your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and all your enemies shall be cut off." And then he just goes on, and then he describes the destruction of the elimination of paganism from out of the land, as King Josiah did, And as the Messiah, the future Messiah, son of David, will also do. So there's much more along these lines, but it all tells us that the Bible is true. Not only that the Bible is true, it teaches us how to understand history. It gives us insights into what happened to history, how it really happened, which is consistent with other findings. And it also tells us or gives us an indication of what will happen in the end times. And this was written down in order that we should know it and understand it as well as we could. May the Lord God of Israel bless you. Thank you.